Okay, good morning, all Yiddish Kinder. Today is Rosh Chodesh Elul. It's Lamed Menachem. It's Rosh Chodesh Elul. Right? It's the first day of Rosh Chodesh Elul, which means we're still in Chodesh Menachem of. But it's Rosh Chodesh. It's Chodesh Elul. Today is in between. It's Chodesh Elul. Today we say Eldor the Shemedi. Today we do not say the three kapitlach. The three kapitlach we start to say tomorrow. And the way it works is the three kapitlach you say for 38 days. From the 29 days in Elul, 9 days in Tishrei is 38. 38 times 3 is 114. And then you have, of course, 36 psukim kapitlach left, which we do on Yom Kippur. 9 we do before Kol Nidrei, 9 we do after Kishmish Alamita, 9 we do after Musaf, and 9 we do after Ne'il. This is a takana from Baal Shem Tov, right? The Baal Shem Tov was the one who said we should say these Shurei Tilim. The Baal Shem Tov also was Masada other things, right? There's a lot of Yonim of Tilim that we do, that we say kapitel for our birthday, that we say these 3 kapitel a day in Elul. The idea of Shabbos Mavarachim finishing Tilim, and of course then the Friedrich Rebbe added Tilim, the Vishachitas. Every day you say Yom Tilim. Today is Lamed, so today's Tilim you can say by heart, right? You know, with Hillel the David. It's the first day of Rosh Chodesh. One of the other things which is interesting is that it says in the Minhagim Teikim Le'islamed. Today you blow Shofar to practice. So the Rebbe's kasha is, if a person knows how to blow, he doesn't need to practice. If a person doesn't know how to blow, he needs to practice. You don't need to have a minig to tell him, here's a chayin, practice. He understands himself, he has to practice. Why is there a specific custom that you're told that you blow to practice? Right? And the dogma for it is like chinuch, yeah? The mitzvahs I say, the rabbanon, to be mechanech your children. Even though it's self-understood, you want to have children who are yidden. You're not just going to teach them Torah, which is a deiraisa, v'shinantam levanech. You're also going to teach them how to be a yid, teach them how to do mitzvahs. But there's a derabana, there's a rabbinic instruction to teach your children how to prepare to be yidden. And the same is true today. You practice blowing shofar, and this idea of practicing blowing shofar is mandated. You're told to practice, which is a very interesting contradiction. If it's practice while you're being told, and if you're being told, how is it practice? So the Rebbe actually says something very fascinating, and I can't do it justice. I can't repeat it correctly, because it's not fresh for me. But the Toichen HaDavar is, the Nekuda is, that there are things in Yiddishkeit that we have to be told to do. And there are things in Yiddishkeit that we do by ourselves. Things in Yiddishkeit that we're told to do. So on the one hand, they're called Mitzvah. You know, these are the mitzvahs that we have to do, and we do them because the Eibishter told us to do them. On the other hand, the fact that we have to be told to do them is because by ourselves, we wouldn't necessarily do them. Then there are things in Yiddishkeit which we're going to do without having to be told. Yeah? The dogma for that in Avodah is Moidani. Moidani is a simple prayer, it doesn't have Hashem's name, and it's the simple expression of the connection between Yid and Hashem, which almost happens by itself. You know, the Rebbe says that even before you say Moidani, you wake up. And the moment you wake up and you open your eyes, you remember the Eibishter that's even higher than the Meidani itself. And no one was ever told you to wake up. You know, you told me, you say Meidani. The Rebbe says the moment of waking up, which is before the Meidani, is even higher than the Meidani itself. So there are Yonim in Yiddishkeit which we're not told because they're basic to us. But it's not that we're not told because they're not important. We're not told because they're higher than a commandment. They're above a mandate. You can't say it. It's what it is. And the Rebbe sort of says that that's the pshat taken le'islamed. The first day in Rosh Chodesh Elul, you're not told to blow shofar. You blow shofar. You're blowing shofar to practice, but the inyan of this shofar is the shofar which a yid cries, not because he's told, listen, now is Chodesh HaRachman V'Aslichtas. Now is Melech Basod. Now is Chodesh HaCheshbon. Now is the conclusion of the previous year and the Cheshbon for the coming year, and so on and so forth. But a yid knows you got to blow shofar. It's a sort of an atzmi is the thing. And the Rebbe connects the Shofar of today to the Shofar of the end of Yom Kippur of Ne'ilah, which is the highest point of the whole 40 days. Right? Moshe Rabbeinu was on the mountain for 40 days, 3 times, according to most opinions. The 40 days started, whatever it was, the 8th day in Sivan, and they went till Shiva Asa B'Tammuz. The second 40 days started the 18th of Tammuz and went till whatever it is, 29 days in Menachem. And the third 40 days started, but Pashtus, the 30th day in Menachem, and they finished on Yom Kippur. 40 days. And the Chazal say that Harishenim Beratz and the Achreinim is Beratz and Kayam Harishenim. The first 40 days, the Eibishter was favorably disposed towards the Jewish people. The last 40 days, the Eibishter was favorably disposed towards the Jewish people. The middle 40 days, the Eibishter was upset. And Moshe Rabbeinu was being made the Eibishter should forgive us. So the Pashtus, the first 40 days and the last 40 days are exactly the same thing. First 40 days, we were Tzadikim, the Eibishter gave us the Torah. The last 40 days, we were Ba'alei Teshuva, the Eibishter gave us the Torah. But of course, the last 40 days are much higher than the first 40 days. Because this is the Tshuva of the Torah of Tshuva. Right? My Shver Zalgazun Alvar Shalom once told me, the Rebbe said it, Mistamen, that you have 2 sets of Aseres Adibris. Aseres Adibris and Pashas Yisrael, Aseres Adibris and Pashas Vers Chanan, and there's differences, there's many differences. There's a Sach Nafkeminis. Some of them are very big and some of them are very minor, but there's over 20 differences, I think. So he asked me, which one was written in the Luchas? Which one was written on the tablets? And of course the answer is there were 2 sets of tablets. Pashas Yisrael was the Luchas Erishenes. Pashas Vers Chanan is the Luchas Shnias. This is the Torah of Tzadik and this is the Torah of Tshuva. So of course you have the Vort HaYadua, right? It says in Medrash. It's a little bit in the Gemara, but it's a Medrash B'ikir. That if the first Luchas were not broken, we would only have had Chamisha Chumshe Torah and Sefer Yeshua Bilvad. The whole Torah would consist of 6 Svarim. The Chumash and Sefer Yeshua. Sefer Yeshua is Poshet, the legal document. It's the deed. It's the shtar of ownership of Eretz Yisrael, Sefer Yeshua. Because in Sefer Yeshua you have delineated the borders of each one of the Yud Beis Shvatim. And the Chamisha Chumshe Torah would be Torah. We wouldn't have Teresh Balpeh. Now, the Pshat of course is that if we had gotten the Torah the first time and the Luchas hadn't been broken. So now there's 2 sides to it. The first Pshat is we would all be Ba'alei Ruach HaKodesh. We would all be in the Madrega of Nevuah. So we would read into the Chumash and know what to do. We wouldn't need the help of Torah Shabbal Peh. But we wouldn't have the Limud. We wouldn't have the Torah Shabbal Peh, the Limud and the Iyun and the Yigiyah. The Rebbe said once on Moed in the Kavod, Moshe Rabbeinu broke the Luchas, which is a terrible thing. What did we get because Moshe Rabbeinu broke the Luchas? That we have that in Halacha and Agoda and all kinds of additional Yonim Kiflaya L'Tushiyah. That the second Torah is so much more than the first Torah. So the Vel Frekt Akasha, I don't understand. You do an Aved and you get more? We're supposed to get 6 Svarim of Tanakh. Now we have 24 Svarim of Tanakh alone. 4 times as much. And then the Halacha and the Agoda and the Mishnah and the Braise and the Gemara and the Saboroi and the Goynim and the Rishonim and the Achreinim. We have so much more Torah. So there's 2 answers. One answer is very interesting. This is the Rebbe's L'Kutei Sichos. It doesn't say in the Maimorim from before this, the Rebbe's Achidish. That the Rebbe says the Eibishter wanted to give Yidden the Torah, which is Bligvul. Arucha me'eretz mida rechava miniyam. When Yidden got the Torah at Har Sinai, they were in a Maila Hachigedol, the very highest Madregas. And they were Taka Dovak and Alakus, and they were Taka Tzadikim, v'chuli v'chuli. But they didn't have the Maila of a Leiv Nishba v'nitke. A broken heart they didn't have. Why? They were Tzadikim. They were full of Eid Elokei. When Moshe broke the Luchas, Yidden became broken. When Yidden became broken, that opened them up to be Kalim for the B'li Gvul and Torah. This says in L'Kutei Sichos. It's the Rebbe's Avod. That the breaking of the Luchas is the reason we got so much more Torah. Because when the Luchas were broken, the heart of the Yidden was broken. Not like before they had Gaiva. But they had what's called the Rebbe. They felt very holy. And this brokenness opened them up to get the Torah Shabbal Peh. All the Arichas. That's one hezbollah. That's Rebbe's Achidish. But the Chiddush which says in Chassidus Bechlal, the standard word, which goes back to the Rebbe and before, is that when the Luchas were broken, the lights went out. The Ruach HaKodesh was lower. So we needed Torah Shabbat. You need your guide. In other words, when you have Ruach HaKodesh and you see a Sefer Torah, and just looking at the atheist of the Sefer Torah tells you how to paskin halach. You don't have to have Torah Shabbat. But when it's dark and you don't have Ruach HaKodesh and you look at the Sefer Torah, you don't know how to do a mitzvah. So you have no choice but to be ma'ayin in the Torah, to question the Torah. The expression which is brought is Bereishach HaSheikha v'Hod Neheda, first darkness and then light, first choshech and then first a kasha and then a teretz. So we got more Torah because when the lights went out, we had to work much harder to know what the Torah is, and specifically to know what the halachas of the Torah are. So the second pshat, the more standard pshat of why when the luchas were broken, and we got the second set of luchas, which is the Torah of Ba'alei Teshuva, we have so much more, it's because since it's dark, we need so much more. Mashenkin, the luchas of the shenas were full of Eid Eliki, we didn't need it. So Chassidus, this is the Arichas and the Samach Vav. Even though the reason the second luchas came along with halachas and agodis and the midrashes and kiflayim with the shia is because there was a darkness in the world that required to have this extra Torah. The fact of the matter is we have this extra Torah. Or to say it in different words, when Yidden are in darkness and they're misyageya, they're harving to understand Tiras Teshal HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and the Eibishter helps them, that a combination of their Mesiras Nefesh and the Eibishter Sayata D'Shmait, they're mechaven lamitosa shel Torah, they figure out the Eibishter's Torah, they reach even higher than the Ruach HaKodesh, which is available in the Torah Shebitzav. In other words, the Torah Shebaal Peh, which happens because you don't see. And when you don't see, you have to harav it, brings you to an even higher madrega than was available to the Eid Eliki. Like the famous mashal that the Rebbe brought once in a sikha. The Rebbe told this mashal with great arichas. He said that it's a mashal from the Frierdiker Rebbe, from the Rebbe the Shver. But in the Frierdiker Rebbe sikhas that we have, it's not there. In other words, the Rebbe heard it from the Frierdiker Rebbe, but it wasn't recorded. The Toichan Adover is that the Rebbe Rayat, the Frierdiker Rebbe, once said in Russia upon him, what's the difference between the limud of the Rishonim and the limud of the Achreinim, the learning Torah of the earlier Goinim, the Talmidei Chachamim, and the later one. So you have a mashal, you walk into a dark room. If you have a match, you strike it. You have light in the room and you could see everything. You could see all the relationships and you could see all the proportions. So this is the Torah of Rishonim. They learned something, they had a kasha, but they had light, so they knew right away the Torahs. But the Achreinim, like someone who walks into a room and it's dark, and he doesn't have a match, so he starts to touch. And he touches and he touches and he makes one mistake until he gets out. Says the Rebbe, this is why the Achreinim write so arichasdik and the Rishonim write so bekitzer, because the Achreinim were in the dark. So on the superficial level, that makes the Rishonim higher than the Achreinim, but in a strange way, that gives the Achreinim a mile over the Rishonim, because they notice things that you only notice when you don't see with your eyes, you have to touch with your hands. That's the mile of Torah Shebaal Peh over Torah Shebitzav. And that's the mile of the second luchas over the first luchas. So going back to the original point, this period is the beginning of the last 40 days. Like Moshe was on the mountain 3 times 40 days. And again, you have to assume that he went up today. Lamed Menachem, or maybe even Chavtes Menachem. Because you can't count the first day. Only the days count, complete days would start tonight, tomorrow. El has 29 days, in 10 days as Yom Kippur is only 39 days, so whatever the cheshbon is, whether he went up yesterday or however the cheshbonis work, this is the beginning of the last 40 days that the Eibishter was now again in love with the Jewish people, and he would give them the second luchas. But this is all in the madrega of Torah Shebaal Peh. It's all in the madrega. It's all in the madrega of Torah Shebaal Peh. It's all in the madrega. It's all in the madrega of Baal Tshuva. And the Yisrael of Torah Shebaal Peh decided with Tshuva. So, getting to the point. Even though it's true that Rashi says, the first 40 days, which begins from Shavuos and continues Shavasa B'Tammuz, the Eibishter liked us, and then today till Yom Kippur again, Moshe Rabbeinu was in the mountain, the Eibishter liked us again, but there's a difference. That liking was the liking of Tzaddik, and this is the liking of Baal Tshuva. And I don't have to tell you the difference between a Tzaddik and a Baal Tshuva. I'm teaching the men and my men. It's actually a shiur for women come also, but it's a shiur for men, and women listen. They're not allowed to ask questions. In the museum, Shabbos morning. And we're learning Matevot. I'm from Bullock. We're already holding now Shoftim, but I'm studying mine from Bullock. Why? Because it's a tshuva maimed. That's not a tshuva maimed. It's the tshuva maimed. It's the classic tshuva maimed. And that maimed begins with a famous kasha and a very interesting signet of a teretz. And the Rebbe talked about this many times. The Rebbe says, "Mipnei ma yordan neshama lamata." Why did the Eibush create the world and bring the neshama into this world? The neshama in Gan Eden is in such a wonderful maimed matzav. The neshama in this world is in shvala matzav. And it could do all kinds of inyanim which are not beseder. And Achman Letzan, it could bring unto itself pagamim and halamas vestadim, we have no idea what, or how, or to what extent. It's unbelievable. And the question becomes, why do this? Take a neshama, which is a holy entity, and find itself in a holy world, and put him into an environment, into a circumstance which is so challenged, and so difficult, and kol adracha b'cheskes hakona. You know, we wish, Chazal say, if we go out the same way we came in, yeah, but we all know how this world works. Yeah. Last night in Shtibel, we davened by alley. You have a minyan, we still have an alley minyan. So one of the Yidden said to me that the Frierdiker Rebbe says that in Lubavitch, in Elul, the fish were shaking. So he said to me, no, if in Lubavitch the fish were shaking, what about today, where are we holding? So, I said to him, you take those Yidden from Lubavitch and put them into Brooklyn without halamas vestadim, you're complaining how come the fish aren't shaking and the Yidden aren't shaking. Take those Jews, put them into our world, they wouldn't have done better than us. I don't think there's even a question. So the Alter Rebbe says, why? Why take a neshama, which is so perfect, and put it into a world, and it's for sure going to mess up l'chal hapachas a little bit. So this question is asked in Chassidus 1,000 times, and there's a lot of answers. But in this Maimed and Matev and Lakutei Teilah, the Alter Rebbe adds words which you don't have in other places. He says there's many answers. Hatshuva ha'amitis. The true answer is because of tshuva. The real reason the Eibush created the world, Hatshuva ha'amitis. There's many answers to the question of why the neshama came into this world. You need to say the Chaliyah, Lashes Leis, not ever Darateidim, the hate of the brew of Zasachterut. But the true answer is tshuva. Now there are so many Maimonim and Sichas of our Rebbe explaining these few words, that the true answer is tshuva. The true answer is tshuva. And Mistama, you could explain it in Kama V'Kama Ifana. But let me start with this. I really didn't. I didn't come here today to talk about Elul, aber es Retzach wird man verbringen. I don't think anybody minds if I delay the Igeres HaKedesh for a few minutes more. I've told this to you many times. There's a little booklet which is called Ba'kodesh Pnima. It's from Shalom Gansberg. He lived in the Rebbe's house. He lived in the Rebbe's house for many, many years. He was very close to the Rebbe and the Rebbe's. When they sat Shabbos and Yom Tov together, there was the Rebbe's and Shalom. And he sat, we actually ate with them. He lived in their house. So he was tricked into revealing a lot of secrets, and I'll print it in a book. One of the most unusual little details in this sefer, it's really startling, it's very personal and private. It's not, this happened in the Rebbe's room. Shalom was in the Rebbe's room in the winter of Nun Beis, the winter of 1991-92. And the Rebbe was pacing the room. And the Rebbe was talking to himself, and Shalom was the only person present. And the Rebbe says to himself, Ich bin geboren geworden Freitag. Alle was werden geboren Freitag, endigen nicht was sie haben. I was born on a Friday. All people born on Friday don't finish what they start. And the Rebbe was lamenting that what did I accomplish? So Shalom was very disturbed by this. Now Shalom was not a big maskel. He's a Pashat Yid. Why he was Zeicher that the Rebbe treated him almost like a son is interesting. It's a fact of life. So he couldn't take that the Rebbe was, so to speak, putting himself down. So he says to the Rebbe made Mali Tshuva. The Rebbe stopped and said, yeah. And the Rebbe was happy. So this book, Ba'kodesh Pnima, was not written by Shalom Gand. It was written by a young man, Rav Ashkenazi's children from Chabad. And he gave it out as a tshuva for his chasana. So he wrote it all up, and his father wrote notes on the whole sefer. His father was the God, the Mordechai Ashkenazi. He was a real God. He was a real Talmud Chacham, a real Lam, the big God. He was Rav of Chabad. So he wrote on this story the following: that there's exactly the same story with the Tzemach Tzedek. Tzemach Tzedek was elderly. Tzemach Tzedek was such an accomplished man, such a successful Rebbe. Tzemach Tzedek was elderly, and he was asking one of his children, what have I accomplished? He says, what have you accomplished? You have thousands of Hasidim, tens of them, nah. You have so much Chedushei Torah, nah. Anything he said, he wasn't happy. Until he said, you made Ba'alei Teshuva. So Tzaddik said, oh, this is taki good. Shalom Gansberg got it right on the first try. I don't know what the Pshat Sheba David is. Maybe should put the words in his mouth. The Rebbe says, the Alter Rebbe says, Hatire To'amiti Uinyan Tshuva. You know why the Rebbe created the world? The Rebbe created the world for Tshuva and for Ba'alei Teshuva. Now, you don't understand it, and I don't understand it. It's a mess. It's so much easier to be perfect and beautiful than to have to fix all the time. Fix. But this is the Ratzon. The Eibishter gets nachas from the Baal Tshuva. The Eibishter gets nachas from the Baal Tshuva. The Eibishter gets nachas from the Baal Tshuva. Either Baal Tshuva is in and out. Either Baal Tshuva is not happy with himself. Either Baal Tshuva looks at himself and says, look at me, I'm so deficient. But that's the Eibishter's nachas. A Yid who does one mitzvah rather than 0 mitzvahs is the Eibishter's nachas. Now it doesn't seem right. You're going to a Beis HaMedrash, this Tayyid al-Teira al-Aved, they never looked out of his Daled Amis. He only knows Teira Aved and Milos Chasodim, and that's not the Kavanah. Huh? A Yid, it's harder makes him do 99 Avedas. The 100th Aved he doesn't do. This is the Eibishter's nachas. It's upside down. It doesn't make any sense. And yet, the Alter Rebbe said this is Tirat HaMiti. And the emes says that there's a mashal from the Mizritcher Maggid. There's a mashal from the Mizritcher Maggid which supports this. It's a famous mashal, you've heard of me 100 times. That is brought to Chassidus. That the Mizritcher Maggid put on a mashal. That there was a melech who had a chaver, a yoyetz, a friend, a sad, who was very close to this person. And then this person did something wrong. He did something which was not lefiruche shel HaMelech. And because he did something wrong, the Melech distanced him. The Melech was Menachem. And he desperately tried to get back into the graces of the king. He came and begged, the doors were closed. He sent his wife, he sent his children, he came to the king's mother and to the king's wife. He tried kol tuv, nothing helped. The king's heart was hardened. So in his desperation, he went to a pet store and he bought a parrot. He took this parrot home and he every day would rehearse with the parrot an apology. He made sure always to say it exactly the same way. So the parrot, the go and the parrot shouldn't mess up the chazorah. The same words. And for a meshach zman, for a period of time, he rehearsed with the parrot an apology. Adoni HaMelech, and I respect you so much, and it's so important for me to have a relationship with the son. Then he bought a very fancy cage, and he sent in a gift to the king anonymously, without a card. The king sitzt dort in den Hechel, the Kenich sitzt, and they bring in a gift. For who is it? It's anonymous. Okay, they open it up. It's a beautiful, beautiful cage and a beautiful bird. And the king is looking at this bird, and the Sodom and the Avodim are all eyeing this here off. And eventually the bird makes his speech, he has one speech. And the king laughs. He laughs. He didn't want to laugh, but he couldn't help but laugh. The parrot apologized. The moment the king laughed, it sweetens, the king no longer had it in him to be hard and tough, and he forgave him. So the Mizritcher Maggid says, you could see this happening. This story could happen. But Hagufa Kasha. A parrot apologizes, you laugh, and you forgive this person. When he comes and he apologizes, you say no. He sends you all of his friends, you say no. He comes to all of your friends, you say no. He sends all of his friends to all of your friends, you say no. He sends a bird. And the teretz is because it's a chiddush. It's a chiddush. Umevat. It's not how big it is. What are you going to give the Eibishter? What are you going to give him? A diamond ring. Give him something that he's not expecting. And that's what makes the king laugh. I don't know if you remember, last Elul Tishrei, we learned the Maimorim from Tafshin Lamches to Tafshin Lametes. Now this year, Mitzvah Shem, we're going to be learning the Maimorim from Lamed Zayin to Lamed Ches. We're holding now the end of Lamed Ches, but our cycle of learning goes from Yites Kislev to Yites Kislev. Those of you who come Fridays, I have a different oilam on Friday. It's a different limud, different chabur. Friday we'll learn Maimin. And we'll learn Maimon of Lamed Ches. So Mitzvah, this Elul, we're going to be learning, the way I do it, I'm going to learn the last Maimon of Lamed Zayin, then we're going to learn Tishrei Lamed Ches. Yutis Kislev, we're going to start again the Maimon of Lamed Zayin, with Hashem's help, of course. So last Tishrei, the Rebbe spoke all about Tshuva. And the truth is, the Maimorim that we learned, Yutis Kislev Tzeit, also about Tshuva. What did the Rebbe say about Tshuva? He says, I'm waiting the Kavod, a flam the Kavod. That it says in the Medrash, B'min, Nimlach, B'nishmeseim, Shel Tzadikim. Remember? When the Eibishter created the world, he consulted with the Tzadikim. And the Eibishter and the Tzadikim agreed, Chesed Ama Yivra, it's a good idea to create a world. But Tshuva was not part of that Hamlocha. Kvayochel, when the Eibishter consulted with the Tzadikim about creating the world, that did not include the idea that a person can chas v'sholom make a mistake and fix it. That was not part of the plan. That wasn't part of the Eibishter's Hamlocha. That's a Chiddush. That's something Kvayochel that we give the Eibishter, which the Eibishter never expected. It's not the fact the Eibishter doesn't know. And there's so many Maimorim of the Rebbe from this year, from Lamed Ches, where the Rebbe develops and explains what it means that you give something to the Eibishter that he's not expecting. How could the Eibishter not expect it? And by him there's no Zman. So he knows it all. Nevertheless, there's in you not Tshuva. And the last 40 days, these 40 days, which starts today or yesterday, however you count the 40 days, from Rosh Chodesh Elul, the Lamed Menachem, until Yom Kippurim, the last 40 days is Takaberotzen, like the first 40 days, but it's the Ritzoy of a Ba'al Teshuva. It's the Ritzoy of a Ba'al Teshuva. Now there's two ways of a Ba'al Teshuva, two levels in a Ba'al Teshuva. One level of Ba'al Teshuva is that in 1 minute, the Rambam describes he becomes a new person. He's not the same person. He becomes transformed and he becomes uplifted. And the Gemara brings two opinions, but the Rambam paskins and the Zayah certainly paskins, and Chassidus certainly paskins that a Ba'al Teshuva is higher than a tzaddik. Why? Because the Avedas bring him to an even higher level than a tzaddik could possibly become. And then you have the Ba'al Teshuva. Today the Yetzer Hara defeated him. Tomorrow he defeats the Yetzer Hara. Today the Yetzer Hara defeats him. Tomorrow, like the Mendel used to say, Mendel Futafas. I told this to you many times. He has his two stories about Teshuva. One story is, I'm not telling you the stories because I don't have the time. I've sinned and I won't sin anymore. And the other story is, sometimes I give him a zetz. And sometimes he gives me a zetz. But the letzte zetz will ich geben. The last zetz I will give. It's also about Teshuva. And the Alter Rebbe says in Lekutei Teilah that this is the Tiritz HaAmiti. Why did the Eibishter create the world? The Eibishter created the world for a Ba'alei Teshuva. What's about Teshuva? He never quits. He never says, I can't be a chassid anyway, so why bother? No. I'm going to do my best. I'm going to make my mistakes. And I'll get up and I'll go on to a nachamol. And if it need be, the last zetz I'll give. You understand? This is the season of Elul. And it's Chodesh HaRachamim. It's a time of Teshuva. Anyway, I'm talking. The thing that I started with was that today is not yet Elul. Today is Lamed Menachem. But it's the first day of Chodesh. It's sort of that day which serves both months. And the Shofar today is called a minik. It's taking this Lamed. You blow to practice. So the Rebbe says, this blowing to practice is not a blowing that you have to be told. A Yid does this by himself. Because it comes from the levels of the Neshama, where a Yid does or is involved with the Eibishter without having to be told. And it's connected to the Tkiyah Shofar, the Tkiyah Gedoyla of the Ne'ilah of Yom Kippur. Okay, so Baruch Hashem, it's 11:30. Yeah, we did everything except today's your birthday, Ariel? Wait, I want to teach a little Igris. The Rebbe says, Hamidu Talmidim Harbe. Hamidu Talmidim Harbe. As much as there is, the Rebbe used to bring the Medrash that if you're human and you're alive, it's never enough. A person never could say, I made it. There's always Mish Yesh Le'Moneh, Reitza Messiah, Mish Yesh Le'Elef, Reitza Alpayim, Mish Yesh Le'Revova, Reitza Ribishayim, and so on and so forth. Until the Bias Glos Bias Goyal Tzad is Gals of the Rebbe. We see the Rebbe take it from a year. Okay. It never finishes. Shall we read some Mikros Kodesh? May I? Yeah, Rabbi Blooming is not coming, so I'm Last Thursday I started reading this letter, and all I did was talk about the person to whom the letter is written. The letter is written to Rebbe Osher Abramson. He lived in Australia. It seems here that he was in Melbourne, but as far as I know, later on he was in Sydney. Last week I told you some stories about him. Rebbe Osher Abramson was a Toman. He had his verwalgert geworden. He rolled, weißt doch, how the Eibishter runs his world. He ended up b'derech lei derech, by the hand of God Almighty, after the Mabul in Australia. And I saw letters, correspondence between him and the Rebbe. He was a Rav. He was a real Rav, made a Rabbi Paltiel, and he concerned himself with kashrus and with mikvatar and all the other things that should be wie es darf zu sein. The Bosher Rebbe. He was a chassid. He was the stepfather of the Gutniks. The Gutnik brothers, Reb Chaim Gutnik had a brother whose name I never remember, Reb Shalom. His name was Shalom. And Shalom Gutnik was Menachem Yomim. He passed away recently. Reb Chaim Gutnik has gone a long time. And Shalom Gutnik was Menachem Yomim. And they lived in Australia. So their mother joined them. And she was remarried to this Reb Osher Ebram. So let's read this letter. Baruch Hashem, Yitas Elul, Tavshinal, Brooklyn, New York, Rav Agonva, Rav Chassid, Vasig, V'Chassid, Yisrael, Kim, Nichbar, V'Naila, Eisig, B'Tzar, V'Yatibah, V'Chulu, Mereinu, Rav, Osher, Shayich. Shalom u'bracha, hello and blessing. Be'iti, Kibalte, Michtavi, I received your letter when you sent it, but the Rebbe didn't have a chance to respond right away. V'es Kveite Rasa Reva Slicha, I'm apologizing to you, and the Rebbe addresses him with an allusion of respect, because of the many things that are preoccupying me, and the great burden of my work. I didn't have a chance to respond to the two letters you sent until now. But the Rebbe is letting him know, I didn't respond, but I read your letters. I got them. And then he says, and certainly this is after all Chodesh Elul. So it's days of Rachamim and Ratzon. You'll forgive me for not responding right away. And then the Rebbe writes to him, it's a practical letter. He was a Rav, he was a Askim. You have to understand, you look at Melbourne today. Melbourne is an Ir ve'ein b'Yisrael. Mamish. It's an Ir ve'ein b'Yisrael. It's a city full of Chachamim and Seferim. And there's so many kehillas. Lubavitch was first in everything. Now, people are going to scream that they're better than Lubavitch. The Rebbe wouldn't be disturbed by that, except that he would have a title to Anash, why are we nicer? But if Lubavitch had not come first and suggested to people that you can make a cheder and a Yiddish kid can learn Aleph Beis, doesn't have to go to public school, he would have never gotten off the ground. The foundation was Lubavitch. And he was one of these people who was involved in the laying of that foundation. I was happy to read in your letter, the details, how much effort was made until now, and how much effort they continue to make to acquire a building for the yeshiva in Melbourne. When the first Anash came to Australia, they were sponsored by Rita Gehasen, Moshe Zalman Feiglin, who the Rebbe called the Avraham Avinu of Australia. He didn't live in Melbourne, he lived in Shepparton. It was a suburb where they had farms. He was a very successful man, and he was prepared to give the Anash Panosa. They came from Russia. The only thing they knew how to do in Russia was knitting. They all did trikotage. They all did it in Russia. They wanted to do it in Australia. They tried. The bottom line is that they started off in Shepparton, but they quickly moved to Melbourne. This is a few years after their arrival, and they're buying a building in Melbourne. Hashem the Eibishter succeeded them to find an appropriate building for the yeshiva of Melbourne. For Kinderlach. There's no. Actually, no. It was a yeshiva taka. The Chevro who learned there were the Chevro came from Russia. Shmuel Gerevich, and there were a few Altoises, and there were a few Serebranskis and so forth. There's no doubt as time passes, you can call him will have all the means, the financial means, to pay for the building. And what's most important, you should have more students. We'll have more talmidim, automatically the secondary component, which is the gashmias, will be there. You asked me what name to call the yeshiva. Now I just want to tell you, go back 70 years. What was Lubavitch most synonymous with? When you said Lubavitch, what moiset came out? The answer is Temchet Tmimin. Temchet Tmimin. The Rebbe Rashab was Meyaseh Temchet Tmimin. The Friedrich Rebbe was the Manal Pale of Temchet Tmimin. And wherever the Friedrich Rebbe went, he made Temchet Tmimin. He made Temchet Tmimin in France. He made Temchet Tmimin in Eretz Yisrael. And in America, he made Temchet Tmimin, Menachem Tmimin, B'nai Tmimin, B'nai Tmimin, everything Tmimin. The Rebbe didn't touch that name. He didn't touch it. As far as he was concerned, it was not to be. The Rebbe did not give, as far as I know, the shus to any moisid to carry the name Temchet Tmimin, besides for the moises, the Friedrich Rebbe name. When there's a new Lubavitch yeshiva, they call it yeshiva. It's Lubavitch, they call it whatever you want. But Temchet Tmimin, I'm thinking that Rebbe Osher was asking the Rebbe to give the name Temchet. But he didn't come out and say, I want the name Temchet Tmimin. He says, what name should we give the yeshiva? So listen to the answer. Im kvar karo was Hashem ein lishanis. If you have named it already, leave it whatever name you gave it. Avol im hu etzlam adayin kedem ha'achlata. If the name has not yet been given, no resolution has been reached. V'neisef al zeh, that first of all, asher al kol ponim. Whereas, considering the fact that b'meshach zman harishon, when anytime you start something new, efsher yiyeh lesader hamoisid matim l'chol hadrishas ha'retzuyos k'refiru ha'chanash. When you start something new in a place like that, at a time like that, it's impossible to have all the things in place needed that it should be optimum, that should be as it's supposed to be. And therefore, the Rebbe says, Harei ha'ta'os. In other words, he's explaining without saying, in words, why he's not giving the name Temchet Tmimim. I know a story of a certain community that started a yeshiva. This goes back almost 40 years. And without thinking twice about it, they put Temchet Tmimim. And they put in the newspaper that they're starting a yeshiva and the name is Temchet Tmimim. They immediately got from the Rebbe a title, who gave you the authority to use the name Temchet Tmimim? The Rebbe never used the name Temchet Tmimim. As far as I know, there's not. In other words, if it was a sniff, Benoit is called Temchet Tmimim. Benoit makes another yeshiva called the Temchet Tmimim. It's the same. Kfar Chabad, Lud, whatever it's called Temchet Tmimim. So all the Moises Lubavitch that come directly from those Moises, they're a hemshech of that name. But the new yeshiva, the Rebbe didn't give the name Temchet Tmimim. And the Rebbe suggests Hata'osi L'Kleyas Hashem Ohole Yosef Yitzchak Lubavitch. I've told this to you many times that when the Rebbe became Rebbe, as soon as the Estalkos of the Rebbe Rayatz happened, for the first year or two, maybe three, all the Moises that he started gave the title Ohole Yosef Yitzchak Lubavitch. And then he stopped. All the Moises in North Africa, in Morocco, in Algeria, in Tunisia, are called Ohole Yosef Yitzchak Lubavitch. In Eretz Yisrael, the Reshes HaMoises that are day schools are called Ohole Yosef Yitzchak Lubavitch. All the Moises in Australia are under the banner of Ohole Yosef Yitzchak Lubavitch. And I'll tell you just a story. I was in New Jersey. There's a shliach named Kanelsky. And I walk up to his Chabad house. There's a big sign, Ohole Yosef Yitzchak Lubavitch. He wasn't born 70 years ago. I said, where'd you get this name? He says, we bought the building at the time the Rebbe was speaking in Memhei 85 about the Sforim. When the Rebbe spoke about the Sforim, the Rebbe said that they should paint onto the front of 770 Beis Agudas Chasidei Chabad Ohole Yosef Yitzchak Lubavitch. So since we had just bought their building, so I asked the Rebbe, he tells me, if we could use the name Ohole Yosef Yitzchak. And the Rebbe gave him a rishon. But there's not a lot of Moises. All the Yosef Yitzchak Lubavitch are the older Moises in North Africa, the Reshes in Israel, and Australia. This. The Rebbe says, you're making a yeshiva, it doesn't have a name, don't. Again, the Rebbe doesn't say it in words. It's implicit, not explicit. Don't call it Taim Chatmimim because maybe it's not B'diok what Taim Chatmimim is supposed to be. Call it Ole Yosef Yitzchak Lubavitch. Asher Beklal in general, HaMoistes Chinuch Shepeseach Ani Ato. The Rebbe says all the institutional chinuch which I am opening now. The Rebbe says the word I. Mishtadl Ani, I make every effort. Im Rakmatim Hadover, if it's only appropriate, Lekarim B'Shem, to give it the name of Kvei Kiddush Menachem Mod, the Friedrich Rebbe, Hashem Meima Van Usheitzim Api Menachem, because we drink his waters and we live from his mouth. All the Yezer of Babish. And the truth is, how many moistus do we have that are called Olei Menachem Mendel? The parable of all the Yezer is Babish, Olei Menachem Mendel. It should be called Olei Menachem. The only moistus in the world that I know that's called Olei Menachem Mendel, Lubavitch, is across the street. Right? When the Rebbe made Ola Teda, it was called Ola Teda, but I'm telling you that was an interim name. The whole Ola Teda was really from the first day, and the Moishe is 65 years old. It was Olei Menachem. It was always meant to be Olei Menachem. The Rebbe, when he became a Rebbe, the Moishes that he made the first few years, he gave them. So the Rebbe says all the Moishes in Australia, the boys and the girls, the adults and the children, the shuls, it's the umbrella. The Moishes in Australia carry the name Olei Yosef Yitzchak Lubavitch. And then the Rebbe goes into a whole Inyan Pnimi on the next page, which I'm going to say for next week. Okay, if you want to do me a favor, you'll come tomorrow to learn